Hello. Hello, I'm here.
Hi.
How's everyone doing? Positioning. So yeah, we will, as usual, just give it a few more minutes for more folks to join. Everyone's doing good. It is super sunny in Toronto. It's still kind of cold though.
We've got summer here today in Brandon.
You want it.
You guys already had it.
We had like a 10-day summer in late March. I went biking like 3 days in a row and I got used to it and it was snatched away.
Yep.
So excuse me. Okay, so more folks are joining. For those of you who are already here, I will just explain. So today I want to start by going over the documentary from yesterday. For those of you that did watch Canada's Dark Secret, I did want to make some space to check in. And I realized that we're gonna have to kind of like push some of the scheduling forward, which I'm fine with because I'm really happy to give more space to the topics this week. A little peek behind the curtain. I'm becoming aware, and I'm sure you are too, that one of the issues with a condensed schedule like this is it's not only that like it takes a lot of mental work to kind of keep pace, but there's also a lot of like emotional labor that goes into discussing these topics. So if we stagger a little this week, I'm okay, and there's space next week to kind of make up for that. So I'm really okay, and if people need to take time with these lectures, and maybe this is a week you do more asynchronously than synchronously because it just lets you like breathe a little in between, that is a-okay with me, and I feel you. I was talking to a colleague about how I kind of planned this week, and she was like, wow, that's a really heavy week. And it is it was really important for me to do it in this order because of the way I think the knowledge builds on itself, and I was concerned about breaking that up, but now I'm like reflecting on that as a choice, and I'm going to think about that as I continue. If I teach summer classes, I'm also really tired. And again, if folks need to not keep up synchronously over the next couple of days, that's really fine. And I totally get that. I'm going to keep offering it. Oh my gosh, a class this morning. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. I'm going to offer things synchronously and record them as the schedule dictates. If folks need to take your time with this, I'm totally fine with that. I am also going to try and make tomorrow a shorter day because violence and gender is, again, a very heavy topic. And I do want to cover the material because I think it's really important, but you have a lot to process this week, and we're not watching a film or show tomorrow, so there's a bit of a buffer. So tomorrow will be a shorter day. I can almost guarantee it. I can guarantee it. I'm just going to say it. Okay. We're at about 4 minutes after. Most folks, we're at about 19, which is pretty close to our daily average, which is lovely. Anyway, as I was saying, and I kind of got sidetracked, today we are going to check in about the film from yesterday, those that watched Canada's Dark Secret. I'm gonna do a little exercise with folks around building a good thesis called Strong Thesis, Weak Thesis. And then we are going to cover the readings for today on health. And I'm gonna set up the documentary. I think we'll do what we did yesterday because depending on how folks are feeling about it, because it's lots of process. So I might do the thing again where we watch the film at the end of class today, and we'll actually use tomorrow to check in about it. Gives folks a break if they need it. And I think it's for these topics, it can be really helpful. You know, like I think it's all well and good to talk about Modern Family 5 minutes after you watched it, but I think it's really different to you know, do that with a documentary on like the HIV crisis. So that's my vision for today, and it does slightly alter the syllabus, but not too much. So I'm just going to give you everyone 2 minutes for those that did to just kind of write down any thoughts or feelings they had about the film. So I will set my little timer again. And so just take a minute, take out a sheet of paper or a window, and just jot down any like questions, reflections that you had on the film, if you want to talk about it. If you watch it and you don't really want to talk about it, it's for whatever reason, you don't have to, no pressure. But I will give you that time now. Okay, and I'll just ask you to wrap up whatever you're writing and just kind of whatever sentence you're on, finish. And if anyone would like to share their thoughts, reactions, questions, either out loud, you can raise your hand, or you can write it in the chat. Oh yeah, Karen.
I found it to be really distressing. And having visited some concentration camps when I was in Europe, when they first started talking about it, I saw such parallels and had that same like horrible sinking feeling that I had when we visited them. And just some of the things that they said, like no one said goodnight or came to me when I was sick. Like I spent most of it crying. It was awful. And also how powerful for the white RCMP officer to acknowledge his role, and how powerful that was for the one Indigenous woman to say to him, like, that meant so much to us, was really special. So yeah, it was eye-opening.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think tons of parallels with concentration camps, and there was one of the people speaking talks about the fact that like it wasn't that they took a class in assimilation. It was just like the whole like, the organizational structure and like the regime, that the whole planning and administration of the place enforced that. And I think, this would be such a hard paper to write, but a paper that kind of looks at dehumanization on an organizational level is there. Excuse me. Karen, the other Karen.
Yeah, so to think that people outside Canada don't even know about this, like what happened, they view Canada as, I don't know, a paradise or whatever, but they actually don't know that people so many years ago actually experienced that. I found it really triggering. I couldn't even watch to the end because yeah, it was terrible. I just can't imagine why you would want to train kids. You said you want them to go to school, but you don't want them to have any memory of where they're from, or and oh my goodness, yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I think one of maybe like the themes of a few of the readings yesterday is the perception of Canada as being this like multicultural paradise that's just like super liberal and lovely, but we have multiple silences, around like that. There's not a lot of discussion and publicity around residential schools until really recently. That like slavery in Canada is not talked about, and so like Canada is like Canada's kind of PR spin as being kind of disingenuous. Olivia.
One thing that I found quite chilling was the sound imagery that was used, accompanied with just the empty rooms throughout the school. It just kind of makes you think when you're people who visit it there can still hear those cries of children. Mm-hmm. And also too, the amount of cement that was just present was kind of weird. Like kids were just kept in cement rooms all the time. Like there was no hardwood, no carpet. It just reminded me of being in like a cold, dark, unfinished basement.
Yeah. I mean, the physical presence of the space is. I mean, I am glad you noticed it from like a teacher critical perspective, but it's really hard to watch. If anyone else has anything they want to just kind of check in about. Olivia, did you have another comment?
Yeah, sorry. One thing else I wanted to say was that I wish they would have talked more about the government failures, because they only mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Act, and there was a lot more that went into that before that actually happened. Like there was like years before, Indigenous people had fought for kind of justice systems, and they were really shot down every time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we can look at a timeline also from yesterday that shows moments of like activism and rupture and a certain amount of exposure that did not. It's really shocking that it did not lead to change. That the Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't happen in like the 60s. Which I think really speaks to like the history of Canada's like attitude towards colonialism, and the fact that colonialism is still like a really active process in Canada. I also appreciate, Karen, you pointed this out. I don't think I mentioned it after your comment. The fact that the impact and I think the optics of having the white RCMP officer talk about his experiences. Like I think. That is a really important thing for a filmmaker to put in, because I think one thing that's really important about this movie and this issue is that this is not just something it's not the responsibility of just Indigenous people to engage with this. This is a collective history issue. And so this has to be something that like all people, like all Canadians engage with. So yeah, so I appreciate that point of entry for potentially for white people watching this, to see this as like as not just like a niche issue. Karen, yeah.
I just kind of something just actually clicked with me when you said that. I went to a Catholic school, and I remember the Indigenous kids went to a school that was really close to us, but not many of them went to the Catholic school. And I just remember being like really taught to disregard them. You know, like not, it was very much like ingrained in us. Like we were taught to be prejudiced. It was horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just gonna, sorry, I've got a text thing. Yeah, I think the one thing that I think is always kind of shocking is just how recent this history is, that the last school closed in the 90s. Because like when I didn't learn about residential schools until I was in university. And even then it was framed as like a historical issue. And so I learned only quite recently how recent a history it is. When I was doing my grad school too, like one of the ways we kind of learned about like our responsibilities as educators towards like decolonization as a process is this is very chilling, is the knowledge that like a lot of the planning and organization around residential schools came out of the University of Toronto. So like their education department, OISE, a lot of their graduates were responsible for kind of creating and administering that. So, you know, like I got my PhD at a school that also produced that system. And that like formal education, you know, we're really lucky in 2021 to be living in a time where there are more liberal and like social activist based programs, but universities are still like overwhelmingly conservative spaces. They still perpetuate like a lot of colonial and elitist like ways of being and seeing the world. And like historically, there's a lot of violence that's been done. So like that's something again, thinking about positionality, as someone who works in academia, I do kind of inherit that legacy as well. Okay, so I'm gonna pivot, word of the week, and we're gonna talk about the theses and talk about the writing. Before I get started with this exercise, are there any questions that folks have? I've gotten a few emails. They were all very productive, and I'm glad you're thinking about the paper already. Does anyone have any questions before I get going about the essay as you currently understand it? Okay, I'm going to dive in, but if you have things and stuff, by all means. Okay, so I'm gonna try and do this so I can still see your hands. I'm not sure how well this is gonna work, but we're gonna try. So we're gonna play a game called Strong Thesis, Weak Thesis. Oh, it's gonna block it, isn't it? Oh, come on. This should work. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a sample thesis, and if you think it is a strong thesis, I want you to put the hands up sign. And if you think it is not, just leave it blank. I'm not keeping score. I'm just kind of like, it's always more fun with audience participation. Okay, so thesis number 1. Someone might write, in this essay, I will discuss the relationship between gender and power. I think this is a strong thesis, thumbs up. Can you do a thumbs down? Do a thumbs down if you think this is a weak thesis, and you can. May not be able to.
Just thumbs up.
Okay, then we'll make the lack of visual representation. We'll make the omission of a thumbs down. Not seeing many thumbs, not seeing any thumbs. So yes, I would agree with that. That this, I would say, is a weak thesis. One, this is basically the essay prompt I provided. So it's just kind of restating the essay prompt. It's also not very specific. Gender, power is very broad. It's an abstraction. And so what I would expect you to do with an essay prompt like this is to interpret it somehow and to talk about a specific example of gender and power. So if I saw this thesis statement, I would be very concerned that the essay itself was going to be fairly unfocused. And you want to avoid that. You want to set yourself up for success with your thesis. Essay question 2. This essay will explore the way colonialism impacts gender. Strong thesis, weak thesis. So I would still flag this as being a potentially weak thesis. It's definitely moving in the right direction. I don't know what that red strike is there. That's strange. The thing is that the focus is still a little broad. And the word explore is tricky because explore can put you in a position where you're just kind of like listing different facts. You're not going to argue something really specific. Question from Amber?
I didn't mean to do that.
Oh, that's okay. It happens. So I think this thesis could be tweaked to be something more specific. But again, I would ask you if this was your thesis to again argue something rather than exploring something, and if you can focus in exactly on what you mean by colonialism and impacting gender. Okay, strong thesis, weak thesis. Using the works of Bosco and Lawrence, this essay will examine how power and gender affect women's access to health. Strong, weak. Seeing some thumbs. I agree. I think this is a strong thesis. So first of all, it interprets the essay prompt. It's not just you kind of take the raw material and you narrow it into a really focused way. You're being really specific about how you're talking about power, like what aspect of power, and you're actually naming the text you're going to use. Although I've used the wrong prompt on this one. Oh well. So this one is a strong thesis. Strong thesis, weak thesis. This essay will use writings by Hooks and Bromley to argue that patriarchy is a system that controls and dominates women. Megan, do you have a question or is that a thumb? Cool. So this one is tricky, I will admit it, because this actually, it looks like it is wearing the jacket of a strong thesis. However, this actually contains some issues that would kind of trip you up. So one of the issues in this thesis is that this is actually kind of Hooks and Bromley's thesis. So in arguing this, it would be really hard to do anything other than summarize the material. They're also from the same day, and they're both very similar in their focus. So comparing and contrasting and kind of like producing new information based on that is going to be really difficult. So yeah, you're likely going to write something with this thesis that's much closer to kind of like a book report on Bromley and Hooks. And that is just, again, you're putting yourself in a position where it's gonna be very difficult to argue and synthesize. Okay, I don't think I need to do that. There we go. Last one. This essay will argue that the portrayal of women in sitcoms directly parallels the way real women are depicted in the news. Strong thesis, weak thesis. Great. I think this is a strong thesis. Again, it argues a very specific point. It uses the word argue and it's going to kind of prove something. This is also a good example of what I'm talking about when I say synthesizing. It's taking examples from two different days. So you're looking probably, I would assume, even though it doesn't name the readings, which is fine. You don't have, it's really handy to name your readings in your thesis, and it can make it easier to write it, but you don't have to. And this is an example of one that doesn't necessarily, but you're going to look at sitcoms, which we looked in 1 week, and you're going to look at depictions of women in the news, which we're looking at today. So you're taking two kind of seemingly unconnected sources, and you're going to compare and contrast them. And I think that's a really great recipe and formula. It can be really helpful in the brainstorming session to just kind of take readings from different days and say, like, if I was writing an essay on these two readings, what would it be about? Because that can kind of force your brain to think about maybe unexpected connections. And again, that's going to just kind of push you in a direction where you're not just summarizing the readings. I'm going to come back. So remember that some of the things we talked about with a good thesis is around like active and specific language. So things like argue, prove, rather than, you know, explore. When you're using active language, that is a pretty good sign that you're moving in the right direction, and that you really want to make sure that you are not just summarizing the material. So again, a great way to do that is to just make sure you're picking people from different weeks if you can, because that does tend to kind of force you to look at unrelated things or things where the relationship is not immediately obvious. It just gives you more to work with. The last thing, do you have any questions about that? What I'm going to say too is that, like, writing a thesis is more of an art than a science. And this is something you will get better at. This is a first year course. This is not meant to be a masterclass in thesis writing or essay writing. So, you know, do your best to craft a strong thesis using these guidelines. If you want to email me to check in, you can come to office hours to talk about it. But if you just have your thesis and you want to say, like, how's this for a thesis, I'm very happy to give you notes on that. And that will, again, it's about just like laying a good foundation so that the rest of the essay can kind of follow that. I'm just really going to quickly go over, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail tomorrow, because I don't want to overwhelm you with essay stuff on any given day. Generally speaking, this is what an essay structure should look like. You may have seen this before. Sometimes this is referred to like the hamburger method, although like a hamburger doesn't look like this. I don't understand that. But basically your essay should be kind of broken up into like 3 different sections. The second section is by far the longest. An essay needs an intro paragraph, and the role of an intro paragraph, I find a lot of times students know that they need to have an intro, but don't really know why. And so the intro just tends to be like since the dawn of time, people have had genders sort of, and I don't know, and now we'll start. Which I understand the impulse to just kind of like generally introduce it. That's fine for a sentence. But the real goal of your essay is to give me as the reader a roadmap to the whole thing. So you should tell me in the intro, like, hey, thanks for coming to my essay. Here's what I'm writing about. Here are the main points I'm going to make. Here are the sources I'm going to use, and here's my thesis. I think it is generally easiest to have your thesis be the final sentence of a paragraph. It's not a hard and fast rule. It's just kind of easy to start a little narrow and get really specific. And by the end, you're at like a point. But by the end of the intro, I should basically know everything that's coming. It orients me. I kind of like think of it like a little, you know, paragraph of a table of contents, so that, you know, you set everything up and you spell it out. Then you have body paragraphs. You have multiple body paragraphs. There's not like a hard and fast rule on how many, but the role of a body paragraph is that each paragraph presents evidence that supports your thesis. So it does the thing you promised me you were going to do in the first paragraph. I think it's best to organize each paragraph around one citation or piece of evidence. So, you know, as you're going through your reading notes and through what articles you're looking at, and you're kind of pulling out points that the authors make, and you make a list of those points, every paragraph that is a body paragraph should be organized around one of those, and it always like proves something to your thesis. You do a couple of those, you know, between 3 and 5 is pretty average for a paper of this length. Also make sure that every paragraph is making like one point. So if you're making a new point, you're probably wanting to move into a new paragraph. So you do those, and then your conclusion, your job is just to summarize and wrap it up. Don't offer new evidence in your conclusion. Try not to bring up a ton of new information. Generally speaking, you should really bring up no new information, and it's just like, you know, in conclusion, I did the thing I said I was going to do. I promised you I was going to talk about X, Y, and Z. I've done it through this. You have the option in a conclusion to kind of maybe if you want to talk about like, where you think this issue is going next, looking to the future. I mean, if you were doing a research paper, what you would do next. If you want to do that, this is the place to do it. And that's probably the last like 1 or 2 sentences. Like, don't do a whole page on that. That's great because it shows me that you're aware of this larger conversation. But that's kind of what you do in the conclusion. The other thing I will say is I think one of the most common errors I see in like first and second year writing is trying to do too much, is trying to be too broad. Again, this is not a very long paper. You and your thesis should be focusing on something quite distinct and quite narrow. I've sometimes happens, but I don't very often write, you're not trying to do enough here, but I very often do, right? Like this paper is just trying to do too much and you're spreading yourself too thin. And what that means is you don't really have time to develop the ideas you're putting out there because you're kind of like spitting out all these great ideas, but we've so little time to get into them. So yeah, be really specific and narrow and again, a good thesis should do that. A good thesis should say like, I'm going to talk about this thing right here. And one of the issues with a vague thesis is that it does tend to go the other way. It tends to be like, I'm going to talk about lots of different things under the umbrella of this topic. And then it's just too tempting to kind of talk about a million things without getting into a ton of depth about any of them. So that's my pitch for a successful essay. Again, I will talk about this more probably every day between now and when it's due. Any questions about that?
Do you want us to like define the terms in the term paper?
That's a good question. If you are using a term, so like if you're using the term feminism, you don't have to like define it. If you're using kind of a common term that we've used in the class, like one of the key terms, you don't have to define it for me because I should be able to tell from context that you're like using it accurately. If you are using a term that maybe is a little more ambiguous, so if you're doing the power option and you're talking about power, that's a good thing to define. Or if you're talking about a patriarchal structure and you want to be like specific about like this form of patriarchy. So I guess the answer is if a definition makes your argument clearer, yes, you should do it. But if it's just kind of about defining a term so I know you know it, you don't have to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. The other thing I want to mention, just because I know there's a lot going on in this class, and do remember that your second reading response is due tomorrow, which is Thursday, by the end of the day. And tomorrow I will also touch base on the term paper, and tomorrow I'm going to talk about citation styles and give you some examples of how to do that. And I'll just briefly talk about what it means to write a first draft and how a first draft works and when a first draft is working. Okay, lovely. I think we're gonna do the thing again because I really appreciated this yesterday. I'm gonna ask you to take like 2 minutes again, just to jot down some ideas about the readings from today. If you already have them, then just kind of use the 2 minutes to like relax. But if you need a minute or two to just kind of like jot some thoughts, because we're going to do small groups before I do my lecture, because I like knowing where you guys are at before I get started. So take 2 minutes and jot things down. Okay, so I will bring you back now and just ask you to wrap up whatever you're currently jotting down. I am going to put you in small groups. Again, you'll have about 10 minutes just to share any thoughts or questions you had about the readings for today. If you find any parallels between today's readings and things we looked at already, that's always awesome, incidentally. So let me just see. Okay, so you should now be able to join your rooms. I will give you a 2-minute heads up before I bring you back. Thanks. Okay, so we're coming back now. Looks like. Let's give folks a chance to in. Just typing in discussion. So if you want to share what you and your group talked about in the chat, oh, I sent that directly to someone. Sorry, Tamara. If you want to put your anything you talked about in the group, or just what you brought to class like before you went to your group, you can put that in the chat. Or if you would like to raise your hand and share anything, you can do that now.
I feel like I'm the only one who ever talks, but in our group, we discussed the gender and health topic quite a bit, and just like about health and how women, actually in the reading, I kind of caught on to this idea that it is this way to subdue us even more. You know, the fact that we're always being medicated even more often than men, and even with things like menopause and birth control, and they're just throwing pills at us kind of thing. Yeah, and what else did we talk about? Just women's health, and if you're having a stroke or a heart attack, it's not always recognized, because we see that in men, but not necessarily women. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a really interesting, we didn't read about this just because there's a finite amount of reading time, but like the history of like medicine and women is really fascinating. And I mean, just Google the history of the term hysteria, and the way that hysteria was basically a medical term for like kind of any number of vague afflictions affecting women, and tended to be a very like broad mental illness category that could just kind of use to institutionalize women who like weren't behaving properly, or had a medical issue that was kind of psychiatric in nature before that was really documented. It's a horrifying, problematic history. I once had a prof whose research was about like the depiction of mental illness in women in like the history of theater. It was all about hysteria. Yeah, so there is actually a long history of medicine and medical knowledge being used to subdue women, and really blurring that line between just kind of like patriarchal domination and health.
I think we should have like longer word count for our papers so that we can write these things, or we'll have to do it in another class.
For sure. I mean, again, like this class is such like a sample platter of things I hope you'll work towards. Yeah, I have a comment here that someone who wishes that the issues of race and non-cis identified women was more of a central focus, and I agree. I do. Especially like in the history of a movement, that is something that has been traditionally overlooked. Okay, I'm gonna pop over to my screen, and I'm just gonna kind of give you my take on the readings, and also set up the film today. So here we go. I'm gonna make it huge. Slide. So some key terms that I'd like you to keep an eye on is undue burden, the women's health movement, holistic, Roe versus Wade, the Morgan-Taylor decision, and PWAs. So I'll just give you a second to jot that down. Okay, so one of the primary thrusts of one of the articles we read today, of course, is about the women's health movement, sometimes referred to as the Women's Health Action Movement, or WHAM. And then I had George Michael in my head all week when I was reading this. The women's health movement grows really directly out of the women's liberation movement for reasons that I think should be fairly obvious. And one of the criticisms of like feminism towards patriarchal control and consciousness raising was access to health, the fact that medicine was so male dominated, and the treatment towards women in health contexts was so egregious. It was pretty high on the list of things to address. So that there's a pretty direct relation there. It's hopefully not surprising. Part of the way the organization was run, which is also very kind of a challenge to patriarchy, is that it was run as a collective, that it did focus on sharing experiences that women had had, concerns that mattered to patients, and new visions. So I think it's important to note that this is not necessarily a group of female doctors coming together to talk about attacking the patriarchy on an institutional level from kind of the top down, but this is very patient focused. And that was a huge part of this movement. A major contribution of the women's health movement, and this is something that, I mean, if we go back to the idea of feminism is for everyone, and that truly we all do benefit when feminists takes up causes to promote equality and to kind of deconstruct patriarchy, is this idea of medicine as being holistic. So the idea that medicine impacts and is impacted by political, social, and economic issues. And this was particularly important to women at the time because that was a huge part of the issue. But if we look at the legacy of this, everyone benefits when health is looked at holistically. When we look at the fact that poverty is a huge indication of health, or that access to medication and drugs, or like geographic location. So if you live in a rural community that doesn't have immediate access to kind of specialty doctors, or you have to travel to get medical help, that's an impact too. So just thinking of medicine and medical science in a vacuum isn't helpful because it doesn't address problems that impact health. And part of the way the women's health movement actioned this was actually forming kind of discussion groups, consciousness raising, which we talked about in feminism. So like getting people into a place where they understood the political nature of these issues. And then also education, a big theme throughout the women's health movement, and some other things we're talking about today, is the role of education, because medicine and health is complicated, and part of the nature of a patient-doctor relationship should be consent-based, so that a patient knows what's going on with their body and can make informed decisions. And that requires education because medicine is specialized and health is complicated. So a big push of this was actually about educating people about their own bodies and health needs. Speaking of the holistic nature of this, much of the early work in women's health, the women's health movement did focus on building links and coalition politics with existing groups that again addressed the way that health intersects with other social issues. So looking at consumer groups and self-help that dealt with things like cancer, mental health, and addictions was a way for them to kind of partner with patient-centric services already. Anti-racist groups that talked about equality and access, including, again, First Nations and rural communities and their access to health services. Looking at traditional healing, look at the intersection of environmentalism and health, disability rights activism. Like obviously people who experience disability interact with healthcare on a much higher rate, and therefore are further impacted by inequality. Medical reform, and also legal community, and the way that the law often intersects with medicine and health. So again, a big part of the women's health movement was really transforming the way people conceived of health as part of their life, and the way it was seen as being something that is truly interrelated, or again, holistic. The initial goals of the movement, which the author defines pretty simply in a way that I was almost kind of surprised, are to examine and transform the healthcare delivery system. So to look not just at medicine in the abstract, but at the way that it is rolled out, the way that it is delivered to people and people's access to this. So if we think of this in a contemporary context, the difference between developing a vaccine for COVID and then the logistics of how people access that vaccine, the delivery system is arguably just as important as the science itself. Developing and analyzing the social determinants of health. So again, looking at the way different social and political issues impact people's health and then impact people's ability to access healthcare. And then a commitment to increase the participation of women in all aspects of healthcare. So definitely trying to address the gender equality of med school, of medical administration, of like government ad hoc committees or people in positions of power who control health policy, and creating more women in those positions, but then also getting women involved in community work and education so that patients themselves, particularly female identified patients, understood the nature of healthcare, because when you don't understand the way healthcare works, it makes it very difficult to navigate that system. So obviously a lot of this springs from the existing criticism of men's healthcare. The fact that historically medicine has been dominated by white cis men has led, so like one, there's internalized racism and sexism there, which can impact the way that people of color and women receive treatment. But even in the most benign of cases, that there is just blind spots that a field that is predominantly white cis men is just not going to think of things that are concerns to people outside that experience. Professionalization, this comes up a few times in the reading. The decision to make medical language extremely dense based on Latin and professionalized is something that actually, again, has a surprisingly recent history. The professionalization of medicine as in terms of language is kind of an 18th, 19th century construct. And it does tend to be around the creation, not only of the science, but of medicine as a career, the increasing medicine as a prestige and controlling who has access to those knowledges. And that means that the average person does not understand medicine and medical science and even their own anatomy. And that's a really extreme power dynamic. If the way that we talk about our own bodies are being kept from us, if understanding the way a disease you have is affecting your body is something that you don't have access to that information, that's a real problem. There's a paternalistic relationship to historical Western medicine, that doctors are seen as paternal figures, as fathers. Patients become very childlike, totally dependent, have to just kind of listen to what their doctors say blindly. If they don't, they're perceived as kind of being like difficult. And then there's like a punishing aspect to medical care, like this is for your own good. Karen, you were talking about this, but certainly the idea that, like, generally speaking and historically, women have been overprescribed medication, that women's bodies and women's emotions have been seen from a disease model that just needs to be medicated, which also has like a capitalistic component, and that there's a pervasive conflict of interest between pharmaceutical corporations and medicine, because pharmaceutical corporations are corporations. There is a capitalist imperative within that, and that can create a huge conflict of interest in prescribing care. And that's really built into the medical system of the 20th century. So again, just to kind of recap here, the women's healthcare movement centers on patient voices and concerns. So it's about decentralizing the power and authority of doctors, really focuses on access to information and education. So it's not just that the medical community needs to be more inclusive and diverse, it's that the control of knowledge needs to be loosened, and like average people who experience healthcare should understand what that means. It looks at everything holistically. I just think I've said that on every slide now. And the demand of equitable hiring practices. And importantly, that women should have access to female doctors if they demand that, and if they feel that that is in their best interest of their healthcare, that a woman should be able to see a female doctor. So the reading kind of concludes with like looking at like what's going on and moving forward. So healthcare reform and healthcare service restrictions is an ongoing issue. Women do pay more for healthcare. We talked about this a bit with the pink tax, but certainly women's health is taxed more highly. Women are, because of the way women are over-medicated, that actually does place an undue burden financially. Women have less access to supplementary insurance and are paid less. And usually those two things go together because supplementary insurance is usually tied to career. We talked about this earlier this week, that women do disproportionately provide both paid and unpaid healthcare. So when the healthcare system fails people of any gender, it tends to be women who pick up that slack. Continuing to address the medicalization of women's health and bodies, often for profit, looking again at education and advocacy rights for women, the fact that groups that in the 70s and 80s started to address these issues, the ad hoc committees that were formed to kind of center women's voices in this, those have gone under a lot of budget cuts in the last 20 years. So there's been a kind of reliance on the internet, which is a problem because the internet does not curate information and the internet does not vet the information. So you can find anything on the internet, but you can also find a lot of misinformation. And it takes an incredible amount of energy to actually sift through that information. Government public policy of the last 20 years tends to remain very vague, is less actionable. And then toward the end, they talk about the fact that there is division within the movement. And this is certainly true of nearly any kind of identity-based politics, is the question of how intersectionality is addressed. And that privileged people within a minority will tend to have the loudest voice and have their issues heard. So in this case, that within the women's health movement, that it does tend to be the priorities of upper middle class white women who dominate these conversations. It creates undue burden of emotional labor for people who are further marginalized to have their voices heard, and they're still kind of silenced. So that's, in a nutshell, the women's health movement, as we're understanding it from the reading. I did want to pivot. No, not pivot. I'm just saying that for fun now. I did want to add reproductive rights. The article doesn't get into this a ton, and I wanted to make sure, even though the readings aren't focusing on this, that we did touch base on it, because I know it's come up a few times. It's come up in feminism for sure, that reproductive rights have been a huge cornerstone of what a priority has been for women's health. Because of the history of reproductive health being such a power imbalance, there's a history of both male doctors and male policymakers literally controlling women's bodies. There is a long history of abortion in the world, like long before kind of like legal medicalized or even illegal medicalized abortions. So I mean, we start to see the kind of quote unquote professionalization and institutionalization of abortion in the 1900s, but obviously unwanted practices have been an issue for all of human history. And that has been something that people have done. Contraception as a form of bodily autonomy was a major priority in early feminist movements because it did completely change a woman's access to her role as a mother when it was by choice. And because the kind of forced domesticity and motherhood of women was something that women were really railing against, having a choice on whether or not to become a mother was a really important moment in the women's rights movement. So, there's a reason that access to reproductive health is something we often think about when we think about feminist politics, because it has been a priority and it has been something that's historically been a lack of justice that women have experienced. I'm really going to quickly just kind of go through this. I'm presenting this more so that you have this as a resource moving forward, but just kind of look at the history of reproductive rights. So in 1916, Margaret Sanger opened essentially the first abortion clinic, or the first clinic that offered reproductive health services in the United States. She actually coined the term birth control, and she would go on to, she started an organization that later became the first Planned Parenthood in the 40s. In 53, the birth control pill was developed by biologists. Of course, it wasn't illegal for more than 10 years later. There was a court ruling, Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, that gave women access to this without barriers, or was supposed to be without barriers. In 1969, Canada decriminalized abortion, but it was still, it created extreme amounts of restriction around this. So it created an undue burden, so that while abortions themselves were not illegal, women had to go through an unreasonable amount of like systemic barriers. There was a huge restriction on what kind of doctors were able to do this, and what kind of facilities did this. So there were still no women's centers offering abortions. It was in a very restrictive number of hospitals. The amount of documentation you had to go through to get an abortion was really prohibitive. So when we talk about undue burden, it's often a way of using bureaucracy to stop people from doing something, even though it is technically supposed to be legal. And this was actually struck down in 1988. The Supreme Court of Canada decided that the legislation from 1969 was unconstitutional, and that women should have access to safe and healthy abortions. So abortion clinics have opened. This is all around what's called the Morgan-Taylor decision. Another important thing to note is the class actions, or the groundbreaking case, Roe versus Wade, that took place in 1973, that made abortions legal. This is not kind of a finished battle, and this is something the US continues to have to kind of defend and contest. But very often when you listen to, if you hear kind of like news stories or podcasts or read articles about the history of abortion in the US, you will hear about Roe versus Wade. More recently, there have been rollbacks and further blockages to reproductive health. So again, just because laws are passed in one decade, the fight actually still has to stay active, because the patriarchy doesn't go away. So in 2014, Hobby Lobby, which you may have heard of, actually won a court case that said it could choose not to cover any reproductive health of its employees on the basis of religious freedom. In 2017, Trump administration actually expanded this so that any employer could use this. In 2019, there was a domestic gag rule that further allowed discrimination against contraception for people in low-income families. It resulted in 50% decrease in the availability of reproductive health products and services. So this is not a finished deal, and this continues to be a major focus of people working in and for reproductive health. If you'd like more information on this, this is a timeline of reproductive health. It does center on the US, but it's a great balance of readable and comprehensive. It's fairly dense, but it does kind of focus things, or organize things rather, in a timeline. So I've used it for some of my research today. I recommend it. It's not mandatory, but it's a great thing to know about. So the last thing I'm going to talk about today before we break for the movie is the role that HIV, AIDS, and gender played historically. So one thing that, and again, this is like one of the challenges of having a finite amount of readings, is that the reading you read today and then the film we're going to be watching is kind of responding to a history of HIV AIDS that I'm aware people might not be aware. So I'm going to try and set that up a little. The reading kind of talks about the fact that AIDS has historically not been associated with women, and all of the ways that is really problematic and leads to increased death. But in order to, I think, appreciate that, we have to know about the history of AIDS. So HIV AIDS, the human immunity virus, or the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is a virus. HIV is a virus that causes AIDS. So there's a difference between being HIV positive and having AIDS. This emerged as a health crisis in the early 80s. In 1981, the CDC published a first report of what later came to be known as AIDS. Early cases of HIV/AIDS tended to pop up in large cities in North America, San Francisco, New York, and initial cases were almost exclusively gay men, young gay men who were sexually active. Initially, the name for AIDS was gay-related immune deficiency, so GRID. It wasn't called AIDS until the late of 1982. And most public discourses did focus on HIV/AIDS as a gay male disease. A big theme of, I'm not going to go year by year, but a big theme of early AIDS activism was actually the silence around it, because AIDS was seen as only affecting gay men. It wasn't seen as being a threat to the quote unquote general population. There was a lot of engagement. Ronald Reagan did not say the word AIDS out loud until 1985. And even then it was not acted upon until much later. And so a lot of the work around AIDS activism was getting people to study it, because there was being very little money pumped in to study this thing, because it was seen as only a threat to gay men. And there was not much incentive on the part of governments to save the lives of gay men who were dying. Protests continue. There is a really great documentary on this that I can recommend called How to Survive a Plague, which documents ACT UP, which was one of the first, it was the second actual AIDS protest group, AIDS activist group. A big slogan for HIV/AIDS in the 80s was silence equals death. And it really spoke to the fact that the silence around AIDS and the lack of care and support from the government, the lack of funding going into it, was actually what was killing people. So the fact that it was the silence around the disease that was killing people. So again, AIDS was and is in North America primarily associated with gay men. It led to the discrimination of both gay men and the misdiagnosis of women. So the article talks about the fact that while initially, yes, the issue was primarily not confined, never confined, but overwhelmingly the population who initially died and contracted HIV/AIDS was gay men. This has changed dramatically over the decades, and in the last 20 years, the largest demographic currently infected with HIV are actually women of color living in Africa. Women's infection rates have raised steadily and raised quite dramatically in the 1990s. There was almost no information around HIV/AIDS for women. Education programs tend to just focus on gay men. Women, there's a TV series came out this past year called It's a Sin, and there's one female character in it, and she her friends are dying of AIDS, and she's very concerned, and she goes to her doctor for she's getting a checkup, and she's like, can you tell me anything about AIDS, by the way? And he says to her, it's like, that's not about you don't need to worry about that, and you shouldn't even be asking about it, because that doesn't concern you. That's just a gay male thing. So for one, this really blocked women from learning about HIV/AIDS, to get checked, to get tested, to learn about safe sex. Funding and activism that benefits people with AIDS has tended to focus on the gay male experience. Even today, a lot of advocacy groups, a lot of social services still overwhelmingly focus on gay men, despite the fact that the demographic no longer represents that reality. A lot of that has to do with funding and the image of AIDS. So we still think, especially in the West, of AIDS as being something that kind of gay male culture owns. So a lot of fundraising leans into that image. A lot of people who donate largely to AIDS groups tend to be wealthy gay men. And so that cycle of misinformation continues in a pretty problematic way. There's also a perception particularly in the West, because in the last 20 years, antiretroviral medications have become available, so that a diagnosis with AIDS, if you have access to proper treatment, people are living longer and longer. So the idea that AIDS is no longer a death sentence has become very popular in the West. And so issues of AIDS is often looked at in the West as a historical issue, as something that we kind of talk about on like Pride Month, and people like watch documentaries about the 80s, and we see it as kind of a historical moment, which completely erases the experience of AIDS today, and the fact that women outside of the Western world do experience AIDS in very high numbers, don't have access to the kind of like active support, don't have access to medicine and funding, and that so much of like AIDS medication is quite expensive. And there have actually been a lot of advocacy groups that have taken on and alleviated the burden of that, but they again tend to focus on the West and really tend to focus on men. So again, in the popular culture, if we kind of look at media representation, most mainstream representations of AIDS are one, male and very often historical. So for example, It's a Sin, which came out this year, takes place in the 80s in London. It's a great documentary, or it's a great miniseries, but it just doesn't do much to dissuade this kind of omission. The Normal Heart, which is an image of the 5 handsome white guys in the top right-hand corner. It's based on a play that's truly fantastic called The Normal Heart, and it's by Larry Kramer, who was one of the founding members of ACT UP. It's about the AIDS crisis in the early 80s. Again, it is an all male cast except for Julia Roberts, who plays a doctor. She's great. It's a great play. I don't like the movie. I don't like Ryan Murphy. We can talk about it. But again, if we kind of just look at the images here and the most popular depictions of HIV/AIDS, it is still popularly seen as a gay man's disease. I think I've jumped ahead and said some of this already. But again, today, despite the fact that the face of AIDS is still seen as a gay male disease, it more often, and a much higher percentage of women living in Africa are people with AIDS. So I should mention, PWA is an acronym for People with AIDS. It emerged in the early 90s, and it was a way to replace the term victim. Otherwise, previous to that, people were kind of referred to as victims of AIDS, or AIDS victims, or AIDS patients. So people with AIDS was a way to create some agency for people and to kind of decenter the death sentence narrative of HIV/AIDS. Yeah, I think I've said all this already, so I'll just repeat it. It's historical. The organizations rarely examine AIDS outside of the global north, rarely look at things like economics, race, and gender on a global level, and that the women's health movement itself has done actually relatively little to address the AIDS epidemic on a global level. The women's health movement is primarily a Western phenomenon, and it has tended to focus on health issues in the West. When it's focused on health issues globally, it tends to focus on priorities from the West happening in other parts of the world. So today we're going to watch Nothing Without Us, The Women Who Will End AIDS. It's a documentary, it's fairly recent, and it looks, I really like this documentary because it looks at the experience of women and HIV/AIDS very intersectionally and from a number of perspectives. So it looks at the way, like women living in North America, women who are involved in the prison system, and women living outside of the West, so women living in Africa, are all affected by AIDS in different ways. But a major theme running through this is the way the perception of AIDS being a gender disease has led to a very serious health crisis being much, much worse. I'm going to come back. Do we have any, before we kind of move on to, almost a pivot, before we move on to the film and talking a little bit about tomorrow, do we have any questions about that lecture, about HIV/AIDS specifically or generally?
Interestingly, I was a teenager when AIDS became a thing. So 1983, 84, I was 14. And I remember like these first campaigns coming out and people, my white female friends thinking, well, this doesn't really affect us. So yeah, interesting.
That is, yeah. So I was, to date myself, like I was a teenager in the 90s, and I remember, so it was 10 years in, And so I remember AIDS being actually a really big public thing. So like my experience of sex education was like all about condoms and safe sex. TV shows in the 90s started like, you'd have like one episode where like someone's cousin came to visit and they had AIDS and we learned it was okay to hug them. And it was a big national conversation. So when I started learning about this history, I was so shocked at the silence of the 80s because I just assumed people had always talked about it. So the fact that there was a whole decade in which it was kind of suppressed, that blew my mind.
It was definitely discussed. Like definitely, yeah. I remember hearing about it, but like 1986, I was 16 probably when I first started hearing about it. But you're right, nothing really, no real information until the 90s.
Yeah, I think the information came much later. And my initial experience of it is that it was important for me to learn because I was a gay man. So one, I was, more vulnerable to it, but two, it was part of my history. It was really pitched to me as like, you should know where your politics come from. I mean, AIDS really did transform. We'll talk about this a little next week, which is my catchphrase. AIDS did really transform gay politics because it was such a major issue, and it really kind of changed the trajectory of the way activism happened amongst gay people. It changed their priorities. I think it's part of the reason that marriage became such a thing. A little teaser for next week. So it's, I think my point is that it's really complicated because understandably, there was a point in history in which gay men were disproportionately affected by it, and that impacted so many things about media and funding and activism, but that has kind of like not only outgrown its usefulness, but that the being kind of cemented to that as like the single narrative. We're talking, I think on Monday, about single issue politics, and it kind of works both ways. The idea that AIDS is seen as a single issue disease or a single identity disease has actually led to a lot of death and misinformation. Okay, so what I'm going to say is so I'm going to give you the rest of the class. Movie is about an hour and 10 minutes. We have about 90 minutes left of class. So if you take a break and then watch the movie, that's going to be most of the movie. Or most of the class rather. So as we did today, I'll just kind of break down and give you the rest, and we will have a check-in tomorrow at the beginning about the film. I hope you like it. Again, it is potentially upsetting. There are there are discussions of death and trauma. There's also discussions of like really powerful activism and some like really amazing people, but exercise caution while viewing. And I'm excited to hear your thoughts. The other thing I will mention is that tomorrow we're looking at gender and violence. And in particular, this is potentially a really triggering day. So I do want to draw your attention particularly to the Williams reading, Digital Defenses, Black Feminist Violence, and #activism. This does have some pretty specific depictions of murder and rape and violence. The day in general, the reading in general do kind of center around issues of violence towards women. I think this is a really important topic, and I would be doing you a disservice if I did not talk about the ways that gender and violence intersect in a class on gender. That said, this can be traumatizing or re-triggering for someone. So if you do not want to engage with any of these readings, that's okay. I'm just going to leave that there. You can also, engage with it as much as you want. If you are going to read it, just kind of like go in knowing that, so you can kind of like ready yourself. I don't want anyone to feel blindsided by these readings. And if you have any questions about that, you are so free to email me or come to office hours. Your reading responses are due tomorrow. The second one's based on this week. And the last thing, and I'm going to touch base tomorrow on continuing to work on your papers. And the last thing I'll say is that your reading responses, I'm going to try really hard to have back to you by Monday, so that you have a couple of days. I'm giving you feedback on them, and my hope is that some of the feedback on your writing for this is useful as you're working on your paper, so that you can apply I tend to try and write feedback that can be applied moving forward. And so I want to give you at least a couple of days to use that. So I'm going to do my absolute best to have it by the end of the day, Monday. So you have a few days. And that's it. So again, the documentary is available on Moodle. It's actually through the university's website. So if you just click on that link, you should be able to access it. And I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you for a great class.
Just so you know, I did click on it and it didn't work, but you can Google it and pick it up it was on YouTube, I think.
Oh, really?
Easy to find, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Kirkson,
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you get my email? I kind of sent it like today after my class.
Let me check. My internet is being very slow because I'm on Zoom. What was it about him?
It was just about my assignment. I had a weird notification like sent really late last night. I think it was like around 2 in the morning.
Mm.
And I like started freaking out because I thought I didn't submit the assignment, but I know I did on Monday. And so when I went to check, it says that nothing was submitted. And I sent in like a picture, like I took a picture of what was going on and I sent it to you. And I started to panic because I couldn't see whether or not it was submitted. And I wasn't sure if like, last week's media response was submitted as well. And I would have followed up, but this was the first time like this happened.
Yeah.
And I understand like Moodle was kind of acting up lately for me, specifically with my grades and stuff, because I had to like contact my professors and let them know like this is what I'm seeing, but you're telling me this. So I was just starting to get really worried.
Okay, let me see. I'm seeing your. Okay, I do see your email. I will take a look in Moodle, and if I don't have your assignments, I'll email you, and you can just email them to me, okay?
All right, thank you very much.
Well, no problem. Karen. Karen, did you have a question?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I went in there to try it again and it doesn't work. And yeah, it didn't work for me. It says not compatible. Let's see, I can tell you. It said something like not compatible with sources. Does it work for you?
Yeah, I watched it
Okay.
over the weekend.
Maybe should I ask the library or something?
Maybe send them an email and just say, because the thing is, it's supposed to be open access to everyone in the university. So it could just be like the link isn't working for you. But yeah, I think if you send them an email and just say, I need to watch this for class, can you help me?
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, folks, I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good day.